Okay, so let's get started. This talk is going to be on understanding Laravel collections. However, before we get into it, I'd like to point out that you can use collections outside of Laravel and other PHP projects. You can either pull in the official Illuminate support package, however that'll come with some other things beyond collections that you may not necessarily be interested in using in your project. Titan.co maintains a package for just the collections if that's all you're interested in. Now, first of all, what are collections? If we take a look at Adam Wathan's book on refactoring the collections, he defines them as objects designed to wrap around an array and expose the operations that we can perform on that array as methods on the collection. Now, what does that mean? Specifically, if we look at this line, operations that we can perform on that array. What he's talking about here are PHP's built-in array functions. PHP has over 81 different array-specific functions that allow you to interact with and manipulate arrays in a variety of ways. Some of those ways being things like array map, which will allow you to transform data, array reduce, which will allow you to reduce an array of items down to a single value, and array filter, which will allow you to filter out items you don't want. Now, if PHP already provides this for us out of the box, why should we use collections specifically? Some of the reasons that I was able to come up with include things like method chaining, which will allow you to have a more fluent interface to work with. The collection library provides you over 100 different helper methods, which might allow you to write more expressive code. And in the context of using a Laravel application, Eloquent already returns the results to us as collections, so we already have that available to work with. Now let's go ahead and take a look at how we might be able to use Laravel's collections to help us clean up some code. Now before we get started, a little disclaimer here. I'd like to point out that the example that I'm providing is simply to help illustrate how collections work. The reality is that this particular example, you can do a lot of this work in the database, and you can argue the database is a much better place to perform these operations than Laravel collections or even PHP itself. However, let's be honest. You've seen this code in PHP applications out in the wild. You know it exists. So while it may not be optimal, it's definitely real world. But let's go ahead and look at the example. So the first thing we're doing is getting all of our employees from the database. Next, we're initializing an empty hourly employees array, and then we're going to iterate over all of our employees, checking their role to see if it's hourly or not. If it's not, we're going to continue. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and add that employee to our hourly employees array. Next, we're going to initialize a total salaries variable to 0, and then iterate over all of our hourly employees, and we're going to add that employee's salary to our total salaries variable. And then finally, we'll return our total salaries. Now again, there's nothing wrong with this code apart from what I mentioned in the disclaimer a minute ago. This runs, it's easy to understand, and everything works fine. However, we can clean this up a bit using just PHP's built-in array functions. Let's take a look at how we might do that. So this example returns the exact same result as the previous one. First, we're going to get all of our employees from the database. Then we're going to initialize an hourly employees variable, performing an array filter operation on our employees array. Array filter accepts two parameters, the first one being a closure containing the logic for how we expect the filter to work, and then the second being the array that we're going to be filtering. In this case, in the closure itself, we're simply returning all the employees that have a role of hourly. Next, we're going to use the array reduce method. Now this method accepts three parameters, the first one being the array that we're going to be using reduce on, the second one being a closure that's going to contain the logic for how reduce should work, and then the final value being our initial carry value, which we're initializing as 0. In our closure, all we're doing is taking our previous carry value and adding our current employee's salary to it. Now this works fine. I personally think that this is an improvement from the previous code example that we looked at. It's definitely fewer lines of code. However, I would like to go ahead and point out a general annoyance with PHP, that being that the parameter order for some of these related methods is not consistent. Let's take a look at array filter. First we give it a closure, then we give it the array we're working with. However, in array reduce, that's reversed. First we're giving it the array we're working with, and then we're giving it a closure. The benefit of using something like Laravel's collection library is that we can go ahead and abstract away some of these little annoyances. Now let's take a look at how this might work using collections. So in this example, we're getting all of our employees from the database. Now remember, Laravel already returns a collection to us by default. So we're able to just chain right off of that a filter method. It's going to accept a closure with the logic of how we expect that filter to work. In this case, we're simply returning all of our employees that have a role of hourly. And then we're going to immediately chain off of that a reduce method that's simply going to accept a closure with the logic for how we expect reduce to work. And then a second parameter for our initial carry value. And in this closure, we simply return the sum of the previous carry value with the employee salary. Now this example works exactly the same way as the previous two. We're going to get the same result. However, we do have far fewer lines of code. I personally think that this is more expressive, and it's definitely far more consistent in terms of what you can expect those method parameters to be. Now, people are going to have different opinions on if this is easy to understand or not. Obviously, the goal is not to write the fewest lines of code, it's to write the most clear and expressive code that you can. However, I think this reads pretty well. We're going to get all of our employees, we're going to filter them down to the ones with just an employee role of hourly, and then reduce those employees down to just a sum of their salaries. Now, there might be a little bit of a learning curve here. If you're not familiar with these array operations, you might not know what filter and reduce do. You can probably work out filter easy enough on your own, but reduce might be a little bit of a head scratcher for a junior developer. So while that might be a limitation for using some of PHP's built-in array functions, you may remember from an earlier slide where I pointed out some of the benefits of using the collection library, being that Laravel out of the box gives us over 100 different helper methods that are going to allow us to make our code a little bit more expressive and readable. So in our situation, this concept of using array reduce in order to sum up some kind of value is so common that Laravel went ahead and gave us a helper method for it called sum. So the sum method works exactly the same way as the previous example. Sum accepts a string as a parameter, that string simply being the name of the key that you want to use to perform the reduce operation, in our case salary. Now let's take another look at just how readable this is. We're going to get all of our employees, we're going to filter them down to just employees with a role of hourly, and then we're going to sum together their salaries. We have all of 3 lines of code, and in my opinion, this is a far more superior example than what we initially started with. I would like to take a minute to point out that in one of those examples, you saw this, employee get toArray. ToArray is a method on the collection class that simply turns that collection back into an array for us to work with. Now, the reason we did this in that previous example is because we were working with PHP's built-in array functions, and they specifically require the array parameter to be an actual array. However, for a lot of areas of PHP, that's not the case. And in most cases, you can get away with using collections in place of arrays. So this example is actually one of the more common things that I see with people that aren't used to using collections. We're going to get all of our employees and then transform that collection into an array just so that we can iterate over them and echo out their salary. We don't actually need to transform them into an array. This example will work exactly the same as the previous. And the reason we can do this is because Laravel's collection class actually implements a number of interfaces that allow us to work with collections as arrays. Some of the specific interfaces that I'm referring to here would be things like array access, which is an interface to provide accessing objects as arrays, things like iterator aggregate, which is an interface to create an external iterator, and countable, which allows us to use PHP's count function. Okay, so enough theory on how all this works. Let's go ahead and fire up our code editor and dive into some real-world examples. Now, I did go ahead and commit all of this code to the Tampa Bay Laravel repo under Understanding Collections. I'll go ahead and link that in the description below. So to get started, the first thing we're going to do, as I do in any application, is simply go to the test directory. And let's go ahead and clear this out. And I think the first example I'd like to show you is how we can get an average. So let's say that we want to get the average age of a user. So first, let's go ahead and create some users. And a user might have an ID and a name, and of course an age. And we'll go ahead and create a few more users here. And maybe we'll give John here a completely different age, 40. And so let's go ahead and do some quick math. We've got 34 plus 33 plus 40 is 107. If we divide that by 3, the average is 35.66. So we'll go ahead and round that up and we'll just call it 36. So our test is going to assert that 36 is the average age. So we might have something like a total age variable that we initialize to 0. And then we'll go ahead and iterate over our users. And for each user, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and add their age to this total age variable. So then this average age variable is simply going to be the total age divided by the number of users. Remember, in our example, we rounded up, so let's go ahead and add ceil here to make sure that it rounds up as well. If we run this test, we'll see that it passes. So great, that works just fine. But let's take a look at how we might be able to use collections to clean this up a little bit. So Laravel has a helper method called collect that it gives us that we're just going to use to wrap this array to turn it into a collection. And if we go ahead and die and dump users, you're going to see that it's an instance of Illuminate support collection. And now what we can do is we can remove some of this and simply call users average and pass in a key of age. Now we will still need to use ceil because we did make the decision that we're going to round up. And if we run our test again, everything's still passing. Okay, so let's look at something maybe a little more complicated. In our next test, we're going to want to assert that the array contains a user with a given age. And let's go ahead and move our users array here to a setup method so that we can go ahead and use it in all of our tests. So we'll create a private user and public function setup. We'll say this users is equal to this. We'll delete it from here, update this, and let's run our test again to make sure it's still passing, and it is. Great, so let's go ahead and start driving out this test. Okay, so we're going to assert true that the array contains some value. Let's go ahead and initialize that to false. If we run our test, of course it fails, because we're trying to assert that false is true. And using our users array, how can we make this work? So one thing we might do is iterate over all of our users. Okay, we're going to go ahead and assert that we have a user with an age of 33. So if user age is equal to 33, then we'll go ahead and set array contains some value to true. And we're going to break, which is going to stop this for each from continuing. And actually, real quick, I need to go ahead and update this as well. Now, if we run this test, it's going to pass. Great. And just to prove it works, we'll go ahead and set this to some age that we know doesn't exist, like 99. And run our test again, and it's going to fail. So back to passing. And this works. It's nice and simple. However, let's take a look at how we might be able to use collections to make this a little bit better. So we'll comment this out. And instead, we'll say to get the users, and we'll call the contains method. That's going to accept a callback. And then we're going to say return a user with an age of 32, or 33 rather. If we run this code, it's going to pass, and it does. Now, is this necessarily any better than our previous example? Well, it is about 5 lines of code shorter, but it probably could still be a little bit better. So while contains does accept a closure as a parameter, it also does this cool thing where it allows you instead to give it the name of the key that you're looking for, and specifically the needle that you're trying to find. So for example, we can get rid of this and replace it with age 33, and this still works. And now that's far more readable. This user contains an age of 33. Done. So for our next example, let's go ahead and do something like getting the lowest age of a user. And we'll say something like assert equals 33, or lowest age. So we might start with something like initializing the lowest age to the age of the first user in our array. Obviously this is going to fail because the first user's age is 34, not 33. What we're then going to do is iterate over our users. And we'll say if the current user age is lower than the lowest age, then we'll go ahead and set the lowest age to be that user's age. And now if we run our test, it's going to pass. And again, nothing wrong with this. This is nice and simple and relatively easy to understand, but we can probably do this better with collections. So what we'll do now instead is we'll say get our users and find the minimum age. And if we run this, everything still passes. So for our next example, we'll go ahead and do something a little bit different. We'll break away from this whole user thing for a minute. And let's go ahead and find the mode of something. And just as a refresher, what mode means is that we want to get the most commonly used value in a set. So if we have an array, and maybe we have a 1, we have a couple 2s, maybe we have a couple 3s, and we have a 4. All right, so the most commonly used number in this set is going to be 2. We have 1 1, 3 2s, 2 3s, and 1 4. So 2 is what we should be asserting against. So we do this, assert equals 2 and mode. Okay, so let's see how we can drive this out in just plain old PHP. So what I was thinking is we could do something like initialize an empty totals array. And maybe we'll iterate over this array as item, we'll call it. And first we're going to do a check to see if that item is already in our totals array. So if is set totals item. If it's not, we'll go ahead and we'll initialize it. Totals item is equal to 0. And then what we can do is we'll go ahead and we'll increment the value of that total item. Okay, so what are we doing here? We're going to iterate over all of our items in the array, and we're going to check and see if totals 1 is set. If not, we'll initialize it to 0. And then here what we're doing is every time we come across one of these numbers, we're going to go ahead and increment the value. So the first time it's going to say, let's set totals 1 equal to 0, and then increment it to 1. We'll set totals 2 equal to 0, and then increment that to 1. Totals 2 already exists, so we'll skip this time, and we'll go ahead and increment it to 2, then increment it to 3. Totals 3 doesn't exist, so we're going to go ahead and set that to 0, and then increment it to 1. It already exists, so we're going to go ahead and increment it to 2. And then 4 does not exist, so we'll set it to 0, and then increment that to 1. Basically what we've done is built up an array where the key is the value from this initial array, and the value is the number of times that it appears in this array. Now that we've done this, we can go ahead and use a PHP function called arsort, and that's going to take our totals array. And what this is going to do is sort our array by the value in order of highest to lowest. And just to show you what that looks like, let's go ahead and die and dump our totals. And we're going to see here we have 2 appears 3 times, 3 appears 2 times, 1 is once, 4 is once. And now to find the mode, we just simply need to get the first key from totals. And if we run our tests, we'll see everything passes. So while this does work, of course we can simplify this even more using collections. So to do that, let's first go ahead and transform our array into a collection. And the collection library provides a mode helper that's going to do all that work for us and then return an array. We simply need to grab the first item from that array. And our tests are still passing. Alright, so for our next test, we'll go ahead and get back to using that users array that we have. And let's say something like we can get a user's name. And here we want to make a few assertions that we have our usernames, and we're going to assert that Glenn is the first name in that array, that James is the second, and that John is the third. Okay, so how can we make this work using PHP? Simply iterate over our users, and we'll simply add their name to the usernames array. If we run this test, everything should pass, and it does. Now this is already pretty simple. Really, what could we do to simplify it even more? Well, collections have what's called a pluck method that accepts a key from the array of the value that you want returned. If we run this test, everything still passes. And now we're down to just one line. Now while this works great, if we go ahead and die and dump this for a second and take a look at what's being returned, we'll see we're getting an array of just the user's names. But what if you want the names and to still have a record of the original user ID? So if we go back to our PHP example for a minute and look at how we might do that, so it's actually pretty simple. All we'll do is go ahead and key it by the user ID. Now if we run our test, they're going to fail. And all we need to do here is change our keys to what we expect the user ID to be. So Glenn was 1, James was 2, and John was 3. If we run our test, now everything's passing. But how do we do that with collections? It's actually really simple. So pluck has an optional second parameter that you can pass in to say what you want to key the returned array by. In this case, we'll say key it by the user's ID. Now if we run our test again, everything's still passing. All right, so for our next test, let's go ahead and look at that reduce operation that I showed you back in the slides. Let's say we can get the total salaries of our users. All right, so let's go back up to our users collection here, and we're going to go ahead and add in a salary field. We'll say that Glenn gets paid $5 and James gets paid $6. And John, well, he only gets paid $2. So total, we expect that to be $13. Let's go ahead back to our test, and we're going to assert that our total salaries is $13. So we'll initialize total salaries to 0, and we'll go ahead and iterate over our users. And for each user, we'll go ahead and add their salary to the total salaries. Now if we run our test, this should pass, and it does. Now you may remember from the example how we can easily do this using collections. This users sum their salary. If we run our test, everything's still passing. All right, so for our next example, let's do something a little bit different. Let's say we want to test that we only have unique results. So maybe we'll have an array again of people, and we have, I don't know, 2 Johns and a Glenn and 3 Chris's. And we want to say that we only have 3 unique individuals. We'll go ahead and initialize unique people to an empty array. And obviously if we run this test, it'll fail because we haven't done anything yet. So let's see how we might do this in PHP. We'll iterate over our people. We'll do a check to see if this person is already in our unique people or not. So if an array, person, and unique people, then we'll continue, which means we won't do anything else in this iteration. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and add them here. And now if we run this test again, it appears to be passing. Let's go ahead and add a few more checks in just to make sure we have what we expect to have. So this assert contains John and unique people, as well as Glenn and Chris. So this test is going to check to make sure unique people only has 3 people, and it contains John, Glenn, and Chris, as opposed to just John 3 times or Chris 3 times. If we run our test, everything's still passing. So great. Now, how can we make this pass using collections? First, we'll go ahead and transform that array into a collection. And then we'll just simply call the unique method on it. And everything still passes. Okay, so as I've shown, there's a lot of different helper methods on collections that'll do a lot of the heavy lifting for you and give you more readable and expressive code. But what if the method that you're looking for just doesn't exist yet? So the cool thing about collections is that they're macroable, so you can go ahead and create your own method. Let me show you how I would do that. So maybe you want a method that says, give me the first result matching some key value pair, and if you don't find it, I don't know, throw an exception. So let's start with the happy path of being able to find that key value pair. So we'll say first or throw exception found. And we're going to assert that we have a user with an ID of 1. When we do this user's first or throw exception, where we're going to look for a key of age and a value of what? A value of 34 for user 1's age. All right, so if we run this, of course, it's going to fail because first or throw exception does not exist. And sure enough, method illuminate support collection first or throw exception does not exist. So let's go ahead and create one. All right, so we're going to say collection macro first or throw exception being the name of the method that we're creating, and then we'll give it a closure that's going to accept a key and a value. Okay, so we're going to return the first user and we'll use key and value, where user key is equal to value. Okay, and if we run our test, this failed because I forgot to import collection here. So let's import the illuminate support collection. Okay, and it's failing because array does not much expected type integer. And that's because right here I actually need to tell it we want the ID of the user that's returned. Okay, and now everything's passing. So we added our own method. We're getting the first user with an age of 34, and that's giving us user 1. Okay, so now that we have the happy path working, let's go ahead and drive out the test for what happens if we don't find a match. And we'll go ahead and we will get rid of this assertion. And we'll set the age to something we know we don't have, like 100. And we'll go ahead and expect an exception for just a regular old exception class. If we run this test, it's going to fail. That's because an exception was not thrown. And to fix that, we're going to go back up here to our macro, and using the first method on a collection, right now we're giving it one parameter, which is a closure for the logic of how first should work, but it actually accepts a second parameter, being the default that gets returned if a match isn't found. So here we're just going to go ahead and give it another closure, and we'll throw a new exception. And that's it. If we run our test now, it's going to pass, and it does. But if we move this 100 back to something like 34 that does exist, it'll fail because it was able to find a match, so it never got to this closure to throw the new exception. So we have covered a lot, but there is one last thing that I want to show you. I made mention earlier in the slides that by default, Eloquent returns a collection for you. Let's go and take a look at what that looks like. So we'll say that we have some users, and we'll go ahead and use our factory to whip up 5 of them and create. Then we'll die and dump a call to user get, which will return all 5 of our users. Before we do that though, right up here in the setup method, I messed up and I overrode the parent setup method. I need to make sure we still call that, otherwise we'll run into some issues. And since I'm working with the database, I need to make sure I use this refresh database trait in Laravel. Alright, so if we run our test, we're going to go ahead and get a collection back of all of our users. And if we scroll up to the top here, you see Illuminate Database Eloquent Collection, which then has all of our user objects. Now, one cool thing we can do is we can let it go ahead and return an Eloquent collection for us, or we can define our own custom collection that gets returned instead. So first, let's write a test to prove that we can do that. Let's go ahead and assert instance of a user collection when we call user get. So this is going to fail because user collection doesn't exist. So let's go ahead and create that real quick. And I'll put it in our app directory under a collections folder, user collection.php. Namespace app collections and class user collection. Now we want to make sure that this extends our Eloquent collection. Eloquent. Okay. So we'll go ahead and we'll import this at the top and run our test again. Alright, so now our test is that we failed asserting that our Eloquent collection object is an instance of the class app collections user collection. So let's head over to our user model. And right down here, let's go ahead and create a new public function called new collection, which is going to accept an array of models. And it's going to return a new instance of user collection and pass in that array of models. Let's import user collection here at the top. And now if we run our test again, now everything's passing. So what Laravel is doing for us when it sees this new collection method is saying, instead of giving them back an Eloquent collection, let's give them back a user collection that extends the Eloquent collection. The benefit of this is we're going to have all of those helper methods that a collection already has, plus now we have the ability to add in some of our own methods specific to the user collection. For example, maybe a common functionality is getting all of the usernames. So we can do that here. Say die and dump user get usernames. This is going to fail because usernames doesn't exist. If we head over to our user collection, let's go ahead and make that. This pluck name. Now if we run this, we've got an array of just our users' names. So the reason I like this is because it gives you a dedicated place to abstract some of this logic of how you do a certain thing. So for example, earlier we did a test where we got the sum of all of our user salaries. And maybe you do that in a couple, 2, 3, 4 different places. And in our previous example, it seems simple enough. This user's sum salary, done. There's not much to think about there. But what if the salary is stored in the database in cents? So now when you get the salary, you want to make sure it's returned in dollars and you have to multiply it by 100. Now in those 2, 3, or 4 different places, you're going to have to go and you're going to have to update and make sure that this is still working the way you wanted it to. But with a custom collection, you no longer have to worry about that. You can instead say sum salaries. Put that in here. Return this sum salaries times 100. And now you have one dedicated source of truth for what summing salaries means on the user collection, instead of having to worry about going back and updating, again, 3 or 4 or 5, however many different places. So this is a nice abstraction to help you keep things nice and cleaned up. All right, so I think today we covered a fair number of use cases for how we can use collections. Again, there's over 100 different helper methods. If you just go to the Laravel documentation, you'll see most of them there. Go to this Digging Deeper Collections tab, and then click on this Available Methods link. Once you get there, you'll be provided with a list of all the methods that are available to you. Just click on one, and it'll give you a definition of what it does, as well as an example of how to use it. And if you're still stuck, feel free to hit me up on Twitter at Glenn Kimball Jr. Tweet me your collection-related questions, or just Laravel questions in general, and I'll do my best to help you out. And that's all for now. Thanks for watching.